Welcome to the show. We have a great show today. This is one I've been wanting to do for a long time. We're going to be making a Bowie knife out of a lawnmower blade. Now, before we get too far into the project, I do want to say I have done a lot of research on the original Bowie knife, and I can tell you that if you ask 10 different historians what the first Bowie knife looked like, you will most likely get 10 different answers. And some of those answers will be extremely convoluted. So without getting too far into the weeds of that whole historical debate, let me just say there really was a person named Jim Bowie, or possibly Bowie, depending on who you ask. He was a real living person who died at the Alamo. He was a historically verified knife fighter, frontiersman, and he did design knives. Beyond that, if you are interested in the history of the Bowie knife, I strongly recommend you go and do some research on your own and come to your own conclusions. But for the sake of this video, let me just say, the knife we're going to make probably does not bear a strong resemblance to the very first knife or knives that were being used by Jim Bowie back in, the 1820s. However, the agreed upon definition of the Bowie knife for about the last 150 years is something along the lines of a large, heavy fighting knife with a clip point blade and a cross guard at the hilt. The knife I'm making here will be a stylized version of that with some modern updates and a little bit of my own style just thrown in there. Now, once we're done forging the blade flat, the rest of this project is going to be stock removal method. I do have another video where I did some more forging. I forged in a bevel on a lawnmower blade knife. And really most of the project could be done by forging if that was your preference. But for this video, I'm going to be doing mainly stock removal. There are a lot of different ways to go about designing the shape of a knife. Some people will use computer software, some people will sketch by hand, and some people will just dive right into forging the shape or cutting the shape out. For me, I like to get some idea of what I'm going to be doing, so I'll make kind of a rough sketch, as you can see here on the blade, and then I will cut that out and usually make modifications as I go. As you can see, I'm using an angle grinder for this. If you don't have an angle grinder and you're serious about making knives or doing really any kind of metal work, I would definitely recommend getting one of these. They're really not that expensive. You can find a cheap one for probably 30 or 40 bucks. It's not a really expensive tool, and it really makes your life a lot easier. In fact, if you have an angle grinder and some metal files, you can do about 95% of the work of making a knife with just those tools. Once I have the shape roughed out with a cutting disc, I'll switch to a grinding disc and clean things up a little more, and then I'll go to the metal file, which is much slower going, but it gives you the ability to shape things a little bit more precisely. And of course, there are a lot of different kinds of power tools out there that can make all different aspects of this job go much easier. If you have access to other power tools, by all means use them. There are some people out there that are like total purists when it comes to smithing and doing everything by hand, and I have great respect for that, but I would say only do that if that's your thing. For me, when it comes to these kind of projects, I'm more interested with what I can make and with the finished result than I am with maybe the process of how I got there. But it certainly is good to develop the hand-working type of skills because it does familiarize you a little bit more with physical properties of the metal you're working with and maybe some of the techniques for getting the finished result that you're looking for. And of course, it's always good to have a variety of ways to do things because, for example, if you're using a tool and it breaks down, it's nice to know that you have another way to get to the same result. Now for this project, I'll be using a 1x30 belt grinder to put in the bevel and probably to do a lot of the edge work too. This is a really handy tool, cost me about 60 bucks at Harbor Freight, and it has definitely saved me a lot of time. With that said, it is a little bit limited. This blade is quite large, and I'm probably reaching kind of the limits of what this little belt grinder can handle. So at some point in the future, I probably will step up to a 2x72, like you see a lot of professionals using. But this little 1x30 really is a pretty versatile tool. I do have another video where I made a bevel jig. I won't be using that for this project. Part of that is that I'm working on my freehand skills. And since we have a hammer forged piece of steel here anyway, we're not going to wind up with a perfectly clean plunge line or grind line. So I figured this would be a good project to get some good practice grinding freehand. Now along the back side of this blade in that clip point area, I will not be sharpening the knife, but I will be putting in a swedge, which is basically just a beveled area on the back side of the blade. Once I have the edge ground down to about a 1/16 of an inch or a little bit more, I'll be hardening the knife and tempering before I go any further. Now in the past I've used water quench with these lawnmower blades, but on at least one occasion I did have a little bit of an issue with warping, although I don't think I've gotten a crack yet doing a water quench. But for this one I'll be using oil. Now, as always, if you do an oil quench, you absolutely have to wear gloves or some kind of decent protection on your hands, because there's always the possibility of fire, and the last thing you want is a bunch of hot, burning oil spattering all over your hands. Now, you notice I dropped in a piece of red hot metal before I do the quench. The purpose of that is to bring the oil up to a more ideal quenching temperature. The best research that I've seen says somewhere between 120 degrees and 160 degrees Fahrenheit is a good preheated temperature for the quenching oil. Now, I don't have a thermometer to drop in here and check the exact temperature, so I'm kind of estimating based on past experience. I will say that if you want to test the temperature of the oil, obviously don't go and put your finger in the oil itself in case it's too hot. But if you want to, you can kind of tap the outside of your oil reservoir. If it's hot to the touch but it doesn't feel like it's going to burn you, you're probably right in the right range. So with the quench done, I'm just looking over the blade, looking for any obvious signs of warping or cracking. And then I'll be tempering this for about an hour at 425 degrees Fahrenheit. Obviously, this isn't going to fit in my little toaster oven out here in the shop, so I will be tempering this in the kitchen in the house. So with the tempering done, I cleaned it up a little bit with a wire brush so I could get a good look at that steel, and I'm pretty satisfied with it. Right along the edge, I noticed there was maybe just a little bit of warping, but it's so minor, it's something I can live with. We'll see as I put the final edge on if it creates a problem, but I really don't expect it to be a problem. Well, that's about all I have time for today. I really appreciate you watching. In the next 2 or 3 days here, I'm going to have part 2. That will be just sharpening up the edge, putting the scales on, and maybe having a little fun testing it out. So thanks again for watching. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do, and be sure to click that bell so you get notifications when I put out a new video. I usually upload about 2 to 3 times a week. And with that said, I'll say have a great day, and we'll see you in the next video.